Wiggle, 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 wiggle.
Now, I hope, I'll tell you what, this is my favourite bit of the weekend, isn't having world-class speakers all over the world coming on to talk about stuff and to be able to talk about their research, sometimes for the first time. My favourite bit of the weekend is doing what I've always thought goes really well, which is mixing small children with psychedelic rock music. I've always liked doing this. My favourite bit of the weekend is when the children in the village are silly enough to let Uncle John, as I think has become for large numbers of the younger generation of the village, to get them to dress up in funny clothes and do silly things and sing funny songs. They all have a good time. But for those of you who are not newcomers to the weekend, I'd like to introduce you first of all, because we don't introduce normal speakers. We don't, I mean, you have to go to a normal conference and it would be, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to Mr. John Smith, who's here to talk about something or other. This is not a normal conference, it's a weird weekend. And unfortunately, Richard Freeman can't be with us this weekend, so I'll pass you over to introduce you to Mr. Barry Padcaster.
Well, Orang Pendek, are you going to introduce yourself to the boys and girls? Yes, I am the Orang Pendek, and my name is Ken Jevons. Now, contrary to popular belief, I am not found on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. I am found in Catford. I used to work for Catford Town Council as an ombudsman, but now I've gone up in the world a bit. I still work for the council, but now I am employed to be the avatar of woe for Catford Town Council. I tell you what, these bloody riots, they even reach it down to Worsary. These riots we've been having, yeah, totally lawless. Somebody stole a mitten from a washing line. They brought it back after half an hour, but God, that half an hour was just bloody chaos. Anyhow, I am here to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Oll Lewis. Now, back in 1980, Oll Lewis found what he thought was an ant in his sugar. It turned out just to be a grain of coffee. But he still laughs about it, even all these years later, he still laughs about it. For up to 5 hours every day, he laughs about it. Take it away, Oll Lewis and his non-existent ant.
Okay. The charismatic American showman, P.T.Barnum, was undoubtedly the greatest ever creator of cryptozoological humbugs who ever lived. Our humbug, for those who don't know, is a con, joke, or something that is given a widely inaccurate description, or puff, in order to pull in the crowds to see a show or part with their cash. Often humbug was used by con men. For example, in the old American West, snake oil merchants would often attempt to sell potions they had concocted with lofty claims that they could cure some unfortunate ailment, better still, all ailments, or that drinking this tonic would aid concentration, make you more intelligent or make you stronger. Barnum would certainly never have seen himself as a conman, however, preferring the description of showman. With all but a few exceptions, like the Cardiff Giant incident where he effectively ruined a competitor, he was careful to make sure that his humbugs were just entertaining, and although he might be economical with the truth, these would not cause anyone else any harm. To say that Barnum only ever exhibited fakes and humbugs would be doing him a great disservice. He had a great many genuine exhibits mixed in with all the half-truths. One tale of a genuine exhibit that Barnum was fond of telling was that of his whale. Barnum exhibited the creature in a large saltwater tank in the cellar beneath his New York museum. Due to the lack of natural light in the cellar, Barnum installed gas lights to ensure his visitors would actually be able to see the creature. The whale, however, had other ideas. The light seemed to frighten it, and it took to staying at the bottom of the tank, where it could not be seen and only coming up for air in the darkest corner of the tanks where, due to the darkness, few people would be watching. Because of this, most of the visitors, hoping to glimpse the creature, either did not or had to stay in the room for quite a long period of time before they did. Now, due to the dubious nature of several other exhibits in the museum, people often thought that the whale was non-existent, and that it would just be Barnum's style to have them all gazing into an empty tank. Barnum often diffused the situation with humour by telling the assembled masses, "Ladies and gentlemen, there is a living whale in the tank. He is frightened by the gaslight and by visitors, but he is obliged to come to the surface every 2 minutes, and, if you will watch sharply, you will see him. I'm sorry we can't make him dance a hornpipe and do all sorts of wonderful things at the word of command, but if you will exercise your patience a few minutes longer, I assure you the whale will be seen at considerably less trouble than it would be to go to Labrador expressively for that purpose." Such was Barnum's reputation that one lady, believing herself to be shrewd in such matters, came up to him afterwards and said, "Mr. B, it is astonishing what a number of purposes the ingenuity of us Yankees has applied to India rubber." Rather than believe that the whale was a genuine shy creature, she actually believed that Barnum had gone to the trouble and expense of making a steam-powered robotic whale covered in rubber. This amused Barnum greatly, and he put up his hands and told the lady that she was completely correct, but hoped that now she had been clever enough to work out his secret, she would not spoil the fun for the other visitors and keep the matter to herself. Barnum saw her again several times, and she would often give him a knowing wink and tell him that the secret of the whale was safe with her. Another of Barnum's genuine shows was John Adams, better known as Grizzly Adams, and his menagerie of tamed dangerous animals. Adams was a genuine outdoorsman and hunter, who would often capture live specimens for zoos from the Californian mountains, as well as training some animals, mainly grizzly bears, for exhibition in his own shows and menageries. His reputation was certainly helped by the fact that he dressed the part, wearing a fine hunter's outfit made of the skins of animals that he had slain, with tails of various creatures hanging down from it and cultivating a mass of shaggy hair and whiskers. Adams suffered greatly for his art, and by the time he met Barnum, he was covered in scars. One wound in particular shocked even the great showman himself. While in conversation with Barnum, soon after they met, Adams took off his hat to reveal that not only was he bald underneath, but his brain was actually exposed. As Barnum watched Adams's brain pulsing away, framed by the smashed skull and septic flesh, Adams told Barnum that the wound had been caused by one of his bears, General Fremont, fairly lucidly, and that the doctors had given him only a few weeks to live, months at best. Adams told Barnum, "This will fix me out. It had nearly healed, but old Fremont opened it for me for the 3rd or 4th time before I left California, and he did the business so thoroughly I'm a used-up man. However, I reckon I may live 6 months or a year yet. Mr. Barnum," he continued, "I'm not the man I was 5 years ago. Then I felt able to stand the hug of any grizzly living, and was always glad to encounter single-handed any sort of animal that dared present himself. But I have been beaten to a jelly, torn limb from limb, and nearly chowed up and spit out by these treacherous grizzly bears. However, I'm good for a few months yet, and by that time I hope I shall gain enough to make my old woman comfortable, for I have been absent from her for some years." Barnum had been negotiating to buy Adams's menagerie, and the chance to obtain it for show, with Grizzly Adams himself presenting it for a few months before he retired and died, was too good an opportunity to pass up, and he hired him on the spot. Barnum was to become friends with Adams, as he had with many of his performers like Zip the Pinhead and General Tom Thumb during his time there. One thing that amused Barnum greatly about Grizzly Adams, more than anything else, was not the man's ability to train ferocious animals or his prowess as a hunter and trapper, but the tall tales Adams would trot out about the animals he had seen with complete conviction. Adams would tell tall tales about how almost all the world's animals were present in California or the mountains of the western United States. According to Barnum's book, The Humbugs of the World, Adams would often wax lyrical about California lions, California tigers, California leopards, California hyenas, California camels, California hippopotami, and even about the time he had seen the California elephant, which he observed from some distance, as it had been quite shy. One day, Barnum saw the opportunity to lure Adams into a practical joke based upon the man's insistence of California's unusually high biodiversity when a German came to see him. The German approached Barnum and asked if he would like to buy a pair of golden pigeons and what would he pay for them. Barnum, being nobody's fool and the instigator of several dubious animal humbugs in his time, saw right through the German's ruse and replied, "Yes, I would like a flock of golden pigeons, if I could buy them for their weight in silver, for there are no golden pigeons in existence, unless they are made from the pure metal." The German called Barnum's bluff and opened up a basket containing 2 living golden pigeons. The showman was taken aback by the sheer brilliance of the yellow, which he later compared to saffron, and claimed it was as bright as a newly minted coin. The birds were so convincing, he almost found himself doubting his earlier convictions as he asked the German where the pigeons had come from. The German replied to the question with another. "What do you think yourself?" And Barnum stopped doubting his earlier words and tentatively replied, "I think it is a humbug." With this answer, the German wisely dropped all pretence that the pigeons were genuine and came clean to Barnum as to how the effect was achieved. The German, it turned out, was a chemist who had perfected a technique to paint feathers and a form of paint that would retain the natural look of feathers in any colour. The chemist was so confident in his ability to produce convincing coloured birds, he even offered Barnum the possibility of buying a rainbow-coloured pigeon. Barnum declined the rainbow pigeon, but he did buy the pair of golden pigeons, which he sent to his Happy Family exhibit. In order to bait a trap for Grizzly Adams, Barnum had the pigeons marked, "Golden Pigeons from California." The golden pigeons caused quite a stir among the museum staff. Mr. Taylor, the animal pacifier of the Happy Family exhibit, refused to have them housed there, thinking the pigeons were too rare and beautiful to risk being eaten by some creature unaware of how it was supposed to act for punters, and the museum's naturalist and taxidermist, Monsieur Guillaudou, was taken aback by the pigeons. Guillaudou excitedly told Barnum that they were among the most beautiful birds he had seen. However, he was sure that the labelling upon the birds must be incorrect, as he was well versed in America's bird species and had never seen anything like this in all his experience or in any book. Barnum suggested that he check his records more closely, and as you might expect, when he looked for the birds in the works of Linnaeus, Cuvier, Goldsmith or Audubon, Guillaudou could not find any mention of the strange and beautiful creatures. The naturalist concluded that the birds likely came from an unexplored area of Australia, but agreed with Barnum to keep the California description on the cage until they knew better. Barnum, of course, did know better, but he was certainly not going to divulge the truth of the pigeon's origins to any of his staff until he had had his fun with Adams. Besides, knowing Barnum's love of practical jokes and humbug, the fact that 2 other staff members had been caught up in this ruse would have amused him greatly. Barnum would not have to wait much longer before Adams took the bait. Grizzly Adams had been exhibiting his bears near Barnum's museum and heard on the sideshow Bush Telegraph about the California golden pigeons that had so impressed Monsieur Guilladou and decided to pay a visit. Adams wandered through the museum, looking at the various exhibits before perusing the pigeons. Suitably impressed by the birds, he then met with Barnum in his office. "Mr. B," Adams requested, "you must let me have those pigeons." "I can't spare them," Barnum replied, doubtless wearing his best poker face. "But you must spare them," Adams pleaded. "All the birds and animals from California ought to be together. You own half of my California menagerie, and you must let me lend those pigeons." "Mr. Adams," Barnum admonished, "they are too rare and valuable a bird to be hawked around in that manner. Besides, I expect they will attract considerable attention here." Adams fell for Barnum's trick hook, line and sinker and replied exactly as the great showman would have hoped. "Oh, don't be a fool. Rare bird indeed. Why, they are just as common in California as any other pigeon. I could have bought 100 of them from San Francisco if I had thought of it." "But why did you not think of it?" Barnum asked, trying hard not to burst into laughter at Adams's preposterous claims. "Because they are so common there," Adams retorted, "and I did not think they would be any curiosity here. I have eaten them in pigeon pies hundreds of times and shot them by the thousand." Barnum was by this point having a lot of trouble keeping a straight face, but milked the joke further still with his stoic reply to the old worldless man. "Oh, well, Mr. Adams, if they are really so common in California, you had probably better take them. And may you write over to have half a dozen pairs sent to me for the museum." "All right," Adams replied. "I will send over to a friend in San Francisco, and you shall have them here in a couple of months." Barnum asked if, while on display with Adams's menagerie, rather than being labelled as Californian pigeons, they could be labelled as Australian pigeons because of the assertions of Monsieur Guilladou, and the fact that this would make them seem a bit more exotic and mysterious. Adams was glad to have obtained the beautiful birds, and didn't much care what they were labelled as, and snorted that they were probably just as plentiful in Australia as they were in California. Adams was overjoyed, not just because he could add the pigeons to his menagerie, but because he thought he had managed to pull the wool over Barnum's eyes and deprive him of a great draw for the crowds. His celebrations would prove to be short-lived. About 6 weeks later, Barnum visited Adams's California menagerie and was shocked at just how bad the pigeons looked. Adams, being obsessed with his bears to the detriment of most of the other animals in his collection, had clearly not been paying much attention to the pigeons at all, save for throwing food and water in their cage. Added to this was the fact that with nobody around who knew the German chemist's secrets, the birds' feathers had grown in their natural colours, giving them the appearance of particularly unhealthy feral pigeons, with barely a hint of their past golden glory. Barnum called Adams over to the cage, with a voice oozing mock concern and worry, and said, "Mr. Adams, I fear you will lose your golden pigeons. They must be very sick. I observe they are turning quite pale." Grizzly Adams noticed the flicker of a smile darting around the corner of Barnum's mouth, and twigged as to exactly what had been going on, and snorted. "Blast the golden pigeons. You had better take them back to your museum. You can't humbug me with your painted pigeons." The showman creased over with laughter, much to the indignation of Adams, who was by now well aware that he had been strung along from the start, but was able to retain his composure enough to dig the needle. But Barnum was able to retain his composure enough to dig the needle deeper. "These golden pigeons are very common in California, I think I heard you say. When do you suppose my half-dozen pairs will arrive?" "Go to thunder, you old humbug," Adams replied before storming off. It's entirely probable that he used more colourful language than that, but we only have Barnum's recollections of the event, which were written for a family audience, to go on for the record of their conversation. According to Barnum, following this prank, Adams almost entirely stopped telling tall tales about animals and was always careful that when he did, the tales were not as easy to expose as the golden pigeons had been. Barnum could congratulate himself on having pulled off a clever prank, but it was hypocritical in the extreme for Barnum, of all people, to pick on someone's trait of telling tall tales, and Adams probably saw this too. Adams, although he did not have the quick wit Barnum possessed, was still no fool, and regretted that Barnum had managed to get one over on him, so he would soon take the chance to get his revenge by fooling Barnum himself. Adams had one major advantage over Barnum which he could use. He was dying. Both Adams and Barnum knew that because of the head wound Adams had sustained from the Bear General Fremont, he did not have much time left to live, and his health was failing. His head wound was, by this point, being dressed daily, and his wife had moved to New York to be with her husband in what looked to be his last few months. Adams dealt with his impending mortality with a bravery that impressed Barnum greatly, and did not generally let on to his audiences of his animal shows just how severe his injuries were. Adams would still perform a breathtaking show with the wild animals, despite the fact that he lived under a cloud of the most unimaginable pain. The audience never saw a stumble or a grimace from the outdoorsman, while the wild animals that had inflicted the death sentence upon him looked as tame as overfed cats. At this time in his life, as well as plotting a suitable revenge on Barnum for the golden pigeon prank, Adams was also thinking about his legacy, and indeed what he would leave behind for his wife. Adams knew he had not been the best of husbands, but he did love his wife and wanted to see her financially stable upon his passing. Not many wives would have put up with their husbands living the outdoorsman life, which Adams led, which would often lead to his absence for months on end, unstable revenue, and him coming home with collections of injuries of varying severity. But Mrs. Adams had now become effectively his nurse as well. After being in partnership with Barnum for 6 weeks, Adams's doctor insisted that he should get his earthly affairs in order and retire, and sell Barnum the remaining 50% share in the menagerie that Barnum did not already own, as he was very close to death. Adams was resolute that he would survive much longer than the doctor thought, but reluctantly sold Barnum the remaining shares. Barnum asked Adams to name his price, and agreed to it without negotiation. But this left him with a problem, as Adams and Barnum had already been contracted to take the menagerie and the show on a tour of Connecticut and Massachusetts. Although Barnum had anticipated a future for the show without Adams, not everything was in place for that just yet, so were Adams to retire right now, he would not be able to stage the shows. Adams himself had a solution for the problem. He would, although at death's door, continue to stage the show for a few more weeks, as long as Barnum paid him quite handsomely for his time and effort. The showman agreed and offered to pay Adams a fee of $60 a week and travelling expenses for Adams and his wife, which would have included the services of a local doctor. At this time, it would have been a very princely sum indeed, but Barnum was happy to pay it as a parting gift to Adams, as it would help him out of a jam, and he thought that Adams's physical health was so bad by this point, he would only have to pay out for a maximum of 2 weeks. Barnum told him this and suggested that after the first fortnight was up, he should return to his home in Massachusetts. Adams thought about this for a moment, and his eyes lit up as he had an idea. "What will you give me extra if I travel with and exhibit the bears every day for 10 weeks? Adams crowed eagerly. $500, laughed Barnum. Adams and Barnum drew up contracts, with Adams insisting that the $500 would be made payable to his wife, as he was sure he could complete the 10-week tour, but did not know what kind of state he would be in by the end of it. While making the final preparations for the tour, Barnum was also engaged in making preparations for Adams's successor to take over the act when the outdoorsman had to bow out. Part of these preparations included commissioning a fine hunting suit based upon Grizzly Adams' own suit at great expense from a New York tailor. The suit was splendid, if by today's standards, rather macabre. Crafted mainly from buckskin, edged with the skins of a multitude of small animals, and bordered with various severed tails from several other animals in the Rocky Mountains. The suit was crowned with a hat made from the head and shoulders of a wolf, which also had several animals' tails hanging from it. To source the pelts of all these animals needed to make a suit in California was one thing, but to do it in New York, the other side of the country where Barnum was based, would have added further to the cost. Unfortunately for Barnum, Adams learned about the suit just before he was due to leave on the tour. Adams convinced Barnum to loan him the suit intended for his successor to perform in when the crowds were large, as his own suit looked very tatty and soiled by this point. Reluctantly, Barnum agreed that Adams could borrow the precious suit as long as he took care of it, so that it could be passed on when Adams retired in a few weeks. Barnum met up with Adams several times during the tour, first after 2 weeks when Barnum noticed that despite the bravado, Adams was in far worse health than when he had last seen him. Barnum inquired as to whether he and his wife were comfortable, and Adams, in his characteristic bravado, replied, "Yes, and you may well try to be comfortable, for your $500 is a goner." Barnum met with Adams again after 3 weeks, after 3 weeks had passed, and he was shocked at just how much more pale the outdoorsman was, and just how much more he had deteriorated. His eyes were glazed over, his skin was a deathly pallor, and his hands were shaking. Barnum reasoned that Adams would be dead by the end of the week if he kept going, and offered him half of the $500 if he would retire there and then. Adams would hear nothing of it and blamed his unhealthy pallor on the warm weather before crowing to Barnum that the $500 was as good as his because he had just reached the halfway mark. Adams completed the full 10 weeks, and despite the fact that by the end of it he looked like he would drop down dead at a moment's notice, he still managed to joke with Barnum that, were the showman not a teetotaler, he'd have bought him a drink in celebration. Then came the matter of returning the very expensive suit Barnum had commissioned for Adams's successor. "Mr. B, I suppose you are going to give me this new hunting dress," Adams stated. Barnum protested that he had allowed him to lend it for the tour only as his successor would need it the next day when he started to show the bears, and as Grizzly Adams had now retired, he would have no need for it. Adams was insistent and asked Barnum if he wouldn't lend him the suit to keep, could he lend it for his final return to his home village to impress everyone there. Barnum felt he could hardly refuse a dying friend his final wish, so agreed that Adams could lend the suit, but he must have it back. He must have it sent back to him as soon as he had done with it. Adams asked if he could have a contract drawn up to that effect, and Barnum agreed, as he was sure Adams would have done with the world in less than a week when he died. After the paper was signed, Adams gave as much of a whoop of joy as he was able to manage and said, "Come, old Yankee, I've got you this time, see if I ain't." Before walking out of Adams' office for the last time, grinning and clutching the money and the contract like trophies. As soon as he had made it home, he took to his bed where he would die 5 days later. However, before his death, he had one final request, and that was that he be buried in the new hunting suit, because Barnum had agreed to let him use it until he had done with it. Among the last words of Grizzly Adams were, "Won't Barnum's eyes be opened when he finds that I have humbugged him by being buried in his new hunting dress?" Grizzly Adams was perhaps the only man to out-humbug Barnum. Okay, are there any questions at all? And can I have a microphone runner? Okay, question from Ronan.
Can you still get that paint that you can put on birds' wings? And if so, where can it be obtained?
I think it's actually the paint which I used to paint the CFZ Golden Baboon Awards.
I'm familiar with that. What about these wolfskin headdresses? I think I'd cut a dashing figure if I were to be seen prancing up and down the main street of Bangor with a dead wolf's head on me.
eBay?
Where are they for sale? I mean, do you make some yourself, perhaps?
I don't.
Somewhere in the Welsh mountains that you hail from.
Not as far as I'm aware, but I'm sure that they could have such things on eBay. I mean, they've got everything else on eBay, so...
Ah, true enough. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, any more questions? Anything at all? Oh, no.
Why do you think that odd-looking man has just gone out with a cup of coffee?
Because he was completely blown away.
Do you know he looked blown away?
I didn't think.
Okay, Richard, go ahead.
Did Barnum ever exhibit any genuine cryptozoological mystery animals? Was it all purely the ones that were known or sort of fake, anything?
Well, as far as I'm aware, most of the stuff which was of cryptozoological significance was all humbug. That's because it did play quite well to make as many spurious claims as you could about things you were displaying.
Thanks.
There were some rare things that he exhibited, because the whale which I mentioned earlier, that was the first time a whale had actually been exhibited in captivity for the general public to view in America. Actually, he had 10 whales. They had an unfortunate habit of keeping dying. Any more questions?